none of their members has ever won a vote as the fringe parties. Okay, so this is an example of a very large number of votes that is wasted in Canada, and in fact in all parliamentary first past the post systems. Okay. So here's an example of electoral systems and outcomes. The UK versus South Africa. Here's the 2001 elections. The Labour Party only won 41% of the vote, but because it's a parliamentary system with first past the post voting, they actually gained over 60% of the seats in the legislature. Okay, and of course, once again, the smaller parties that are not regionally concentrated, like the Liberal Democrats, are disadvantaged because they received almost 20% of the vote, yet they received less than 10% of the seats in the House of Commons. Proportional representation in South Africa, on the other hand, we see that the ANC received 2/3 of the vote, and then they received 2/3 of the votes in the legislature as well. So it's much more proportional. Okay, so I mean, there's this argument that this is fair. Proportional representation is fair because it's more representative of the diverse interests in a society, which is true. But then, on the other hand, there's the argument that by having first past the post systems, what you do is you allow for majorities to form relatively easily in Parliament, which is more efficient. So it allows the governing party to actually govern. Here, in a lot of cases, what you have now, the African National Congress, given historical reasons, is predominant in South Africa. But if a couple of these parties, or 3 or 4 of them, were to become much more prominent, then you could have a much more equitable distribution of voting across these parties, and then it may be the situation where it would be tough to get parties to agree on a majority in Parliament, which is what you have found recently in Belgium. Take a look at my blog to see the problem in Belgium, which didn't have a government for about 8 months, just because of that problem. So there's there's this sort of the trade-off between efficiency and fairness. All right. So Duverger's law, essentially Duverger tried to argued that there was a link between the type of district and how many parties were formed. So in single-member districts, what we have is fewer large parties, like you have in the United States, in Canada, in Britain. In proportional representation, or multi-member districts, where votes are cast for parties, you have more parties and smaller parties. And that's what you find in sort of the proportional representation, the parliamentary systems in Europe, in most of Europe, like Italy, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Belgium, etc. And a mixed system, you have a mixed outcome, and this is what you have in Germany, for instance, which is a mixed system in which half the votes are sort of single-member districts, and then half the seats are single-member district, and the other half are party lists. Okay, so competition. Political parties are important. I won't belabor that. You can sort of take a look at that. Separation of powers. You all know about this. The 3 different branches, right? The executive. Actually, an important point. The executive branch really consists of 2 roles: a head of state and a head of government. And what's important is that in the United States, for instance, the president is sort of the fusion of both of head of state and head of government. In parliamentary systems, the head of state and the head of government are divided up, sometimes between a president and a prime minister, as is the case, for instance, in Germany, even where the president isn't very strong, but also the case in France, where the president is quite strong, or in Britain, for instance, where the monarch is the head of state, currently Queen Elizabeth, and the head of government, though, is the Prime Minister Gordon Brown currently. Okay, prime ministers versus president, right? 3 types of executives, as I said: prime ministerial, presidential, semi-presidential. Prime minister is a chief executive, right? And this is important. The electors, he or she is, as is the case with Angela Merkel in Germany currently, is elected by members of the legislature and not directly by the public. So the public directly elects officials or representatives, party representatives, who then sit in Parliament, who then vote for the Prime Minister. Most European countries are like this, and some, obviously some post and also ex-British colonies as well. Most ex-British colonies. In the presidential system, where the president is a chief executive, he is generally directly elected by the people. Of course, as we know in the United States, technically the president is not directly elected by the people. There's something called the Electoral College. But generally the presidential system is only at play in the United States and most Latin American countries. There was some presidentialism in Eastern Europe in the immediate aftermath of the fall of communism, but now most of those have transitioned, the vast majority of those have transitioned into parliamentary systems as well. And then semi-presidential, which is sort of a mix between the two. The president is directly elected by the people, but the prime minister is elected by parliament. The president's usually stronger, has more formal powers. An example of this system, probably a very good example, is France, where there's a strong president and a strong prime minister as well. Okay, so here we have just an example. All right, and then the legislature. Okay, we know what that is. They can be either unicameral or bicameral. And the bicameral generally represents regions equally in Parliament, like we have in the United States, where the states are represented equally, despite the fact that some states like California, on the basis of population, are much larger than other states like Wyoming. Despite that, there's equal representation in the Senate. Which house is more powerful? That's a good question. What are some advantages or disadvantages of a bicameral legislature? Think about that. Okay, the judiciary, that's not that important. And then liberty, civil rights. Civil rights, civil rights are the fundamental and inalienable shared rights, such as freedom of speech, assembly, equal treatment under the law, etc. Now, these civil rights are what are called first-generation rights, and they're the rights that are embodied in most constitutions and in bills of rights, etc. Like in the United States, in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which actually only has existed since about 1982. Some states also protect second-generation rights. Now, second-generation rights, can you think of what these are? They're not the civil rights of the first generation, but they're social and economic rights, like the right to education, employment, healthcare, minimum standard of living. Some countries, some states, like Sweden, for instance, actually explicitly in the Constitution guarantee these second-generation social and economic rights. Other countries like the United States, of course, do not. And they're typically found in social democratic regimes, political economies, as we saw in Chapter 4. And communist regimes typically guaranteed second-generation rights, but not first-generation rights. Okay. And just, what's this? Oh, civil society. So here's the sort of tripartite division of society again, between the state, civil society, and the market. And what we have is, the link. One of the main links between the state and civil society are political parties, and that's really what their most important function is, right? They kind of link civil society and the state, and they are generally formed in civil society. Political parties are, for instance, the Democratic Party in the United States is a civil society function. What it does is it determines on the basis of its statutes and its regulations how it will select its individuals to compete for political office. Okay. The Republican Party is the same. So political parties are an important link between civil society and the state. Okay.